First of all, thank you very much for coming. My name is Simon Taylor. I'm the news editor of European Voice, and I'm going to be moderating this evening's event. And it looks like we've got a very good turnout, which is always rewarding, because I think we have a very interesting event with a very wide and stimulating range of speakers. As you may know, Comment Visions is a series of debates together that European Voice runs together with Euronews in association with Shell. That we have them roughly 4 times a year on different topics relating to energy and climate change policy. And looking around the room, I recognise many of you from previous events. The subject of today's event is making the shift to a low-carbon economy, the EU's energy roadmap for 2050. Many of you in the room will be familiar with this long-awaited document. We have Mrs. Verstorfer from the European Commission, who's, I think, working closely on it. I'll just quickly introduce the speakers, and I'll just say a few words about the roadmap and the running order tonight. To start off, we have Mechtel Verstorfer, Head of Unit from DG Energy. We have Chris Davis, Liberal Democrat MEP, who's the rapporteur on the low-carbon economy. We have Kevin Welsh, Corporate Vice President Strategy Europe at GDF Suez. Tara Billingsley, Senior Staff Member from the Committee on Energy in the US Senate. And Nick Mabey, Founding Director and Chief Executive of E3G. The environmental technology solution company. Just to explain the running order tonight, Mrs. Verstorfer will start off with an introduction on the 2050 energy roadmap. Then I'd like to hand over to Chris Davis to comment, then to Mr. Welsh, then Ms. Billingsley, and then finally to Nick. Each of the speakers will have 5 to 7 minutes to outline what they expect to be in the roadmap. You have an enormous advantage, of course. And maybe if you would like, and maybe invite you as well to comment on how the politics surrounding the roadmap have changed in the last 18 to 24 months, possibly in view of the financial crisis. I think we are in a changing political environment, and it would be quite interesting to see how that feeds into the roadmap. After speakers have given their presentation, we're going to open the floor for what I hope is a lively panel debate. We've got about an hour for that debate. And then following the debate, we will have conclusions by Graham Sweeney, who's Executive Vice President of Shell. And then we'll have a networking reception afterwards, where hopefully you can carry on some of these debates on an informal basis. I've just been reminded to add a few comments apart from in addition to the Comment Visions event. It's also possible to take part in debates online and to make contributions. The topic changes every month. So there's an opportunity for those of you who want to share your opinions to do so. Just few introductory comments before I hand over to the real experts. I think anyone who's involved with the 2050 roadmap has been staggered by the scale of ambition involved, the size of the greenhouse gas reductions involved, and what those figures mean converted into different sectors. The power sector should reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 90% by 2050, industry by 80%, transport by 60%. These are all very, very tough targets to achieve, and so it'll be very interesting to see the ways in which those ambitious targets, whether it's going to be possible and how we go about actually achieving them. So I'd like to hand over to Mrs. Verstorfer.
Thank you very much, and good evening to everybody. Thank you for inviting me. I will outline a little bit what we are now preparing for the Energy Roadmap 2050. The document as such will be adopted by the Commission before the end of the year. So it's still a lot under preparation, but I will give you already the main ideas or objectives of it. So first of all, in the energy field, our main policy until 2020, the Energy 2020 strategy with the well-known 2020 targets, is there and it should be fully implemented. That we need to remember also, if we speak about the long term, the 2050, that we first go to the 2020, implement the 3 targets. Then obviously we have the 2050 target, and the only one we have for the time being is the reduction of greenhouse gas emission by 80 to 95%. And that, as you said, would mean a rather complete decarbonization of the power sector. And then the Commission, as you know, came up with a low-carbon economy roadmap in March. And then also the transport sector was already covered by a white paper on the transport sector 2050 by the end of March. And for us, that's a given. I mean, we are part of that exercise. We work closely together, and we take those statements and policy calculations and scenarios from the low-carbon economy roadmap as a given, and we go then now deeper in the analysis of the energy sector. So I think in that context, we are part of that 2050 work altogether. The energy sector, maybe that is in our paper quite strongly expressed. We have the decarbonization target, but we have also the competitiveness aspects and the security of supply. These are the 3 pillars, as I mentioned already in the 2020 strategy, and obviously there we see a number of links, trade-offs eventually, how to fulfill these 3 objectives: competitiveness, security of supply, and decarbonization. So what we did so far, we had a public consultation which ran from December till March. We got more than 400 replies. We have a report of that already published. We have a lot of dialogue with the different stakeholders, be it companies, NGOs, member states, IEA, others. So we are studying very, very carefully of what already exists in the 2050 work, and there are more and more papers are coming up. We did also our own scenarios, where we, and I can maybe explain a little bit what we did there, where we, as I said, worked on the assumption that we, for the energy sector, we need to reduce by 85% the CO2 emissions. This is also part of the low-carbon economy roadmap. And in the energy sector, for us, there are mainly 4 tools, 4 drivers to do that. That's clearly energy efficiency, it's renewables, so energy renewable sources, it's CCS and nuclear. If we want to go for decarbonizations, these are the 4 drivers. And that, what we modeled in our scenarios, which are the basis of the impact assessment we have prepared or we are preparing. And I will come to some common views out of these scenarios. We try to have a range of these scenarios going to a high end on the one side, for example, for renewables, go to a lower end on other aspects to compare and have also, in a way, reflected the differences which exist in member states. Shouldn't forget that in energy policy, the situation of the different energy sources are quite different in the member state, and the question of energy mix is the competence of member states. So on that basis, we did our scenario. We are not coming up with one pathway for 2050. I think given the different possibilities, we will show the different trade-offs, as I say. There's one clear message which we have is that if we would do the business as usual, we would roughly come to 40% greenhouse gas emission reduction. So we obviously need to step up our efforts. There is a lot of uncertainty, and that we shouldn't forget. Technology uncertainty, economically, other events which might happen. So all that there's a certain degree of uncertainty. But as we can say, and that's one of the outcomes of our scenarios, and a lot of other stakeholders have stated, the decarbonization is feasible. The 80% is economically and technically feasible, and there are different ways to achieve it. What we need in the future, as I said, is not one pathway, but what is already sure that we need to continue our efforts in the energy efficiency. And there the Commission has already tabled in June a directive on energy efficiency. So this obviously needs to be implemented and now through the interinstitutional discussions adopted. We have also in the other field, we are monitoring together with the colleagues the progress on the other targets. So this needs to continue. And then apart from energy efficiency, there's also a clear need for more renewables, and that is then the question of how much. And then if we want to continue with fossil fuels, we need CCS, and we need to continue and promote CCS. And what we say on nuclear is for those countries who have nuclear and want to continue with nuclear, it's one of the pathways. What is maybe also common that we live in a world where energy has very long span investments, so it's minimum 20 years. If you go to nuclear, it can be 60 years and more. That's why predictability is quite key. And there, in that context, 2030 is a key area, and even I would say 2020 to 2030 is something we are focusing on also in our Energy Roadmap 2050, and then obviously beyond. What exactly we will propose for 2030, that's in the discussion now we have internally, but we have had a first discussion with the member states in the informal Energy Council in May in Budapest, where the idea of milestones was positively seen by, I would say, all member states. Then on policy actions in the document, as I said, one thing is to continue and implement 2020, to go further in the internal market and infrastructure. That's also a key area, whatever energy resources we have, and if we go for more renewables, we certainly need investment in infrastructure. As I said, we need more energy efficiency, and we need promote CCS if we want to continue with gas and coal and in the future. These are the main lines. It's rather broad, but as I said, it's work in progress, and we will hopefully have the text adopted by the end of the year. Thank you.
I'd like to hand over to Chris Davis.
Two questions. First, do we accept the view of the majority of scientists that man-made global warming is taking place and that it will have dangerous consequences? Second, should Europe act to curb its global warming emissions even if no international agreement is put in place requiring other countries to do the same? I think these two questions shape the reality of the political debate, because there's a lot of voters, a lot of MEPs, and probably a good few ministers in governments across Europe who don't have confidence in the science of global warming, certainly not sufficiently to put up their hands at the right time to demonstrate their conviction. I wish some of them would stop criticising those of us who are trying to do something about it and explain a bit more why they challenge the view of the majority of scientists, but they tend, I think, on the whole, to be more silent on that score. But I have more sympathy for the Polish argument. Let's call it the Polish argument. It could be summed up like this. Why should we curb our coal-powered power stations when China is going hell for leather to build new ones? What's the point of going it alone? Now, of course, China is big on coal, but it's also developing green technologies faster than anyone else. And I think most people would say they're the future. If you look 50 years or 100 years from now, you just don't see our energy pattern being the same. We've already lost out on photovoltaic. Europe has lost out to the Far East. There's the risk that the manufacturing sector, one by one, will lose out because we are failing to make the right steps now. We can't afford to get left behind. I think it's very important to present the argument in economic terms because this is good for Europe's business. I do feel sometimes that we're at risk of clinging on to what we know for too long. my impression of Britain in the 1950s, once the world's foremost manufacturing nation, is of a country which was clinging on to old equipment, time-expired stuff that we'd been using in the 1920s, while Germany was going through its economic miracle. I think with a bit of help from some of us, but still, it was doing it. And it wasn't making the investments, and we didn't. And the results are all too clear. And we're in the position of Europe of being in the same position, of falling behind what is happening in the Far East. Now, for all the acknowledgements we paid to the IPCC's calls for developing nations to make 80 to 95% cuts, the only policy we have in place is that of reducing emissions by 20% by 2020. But the power sector, we know, wants to plan for the future. 2020 is neither here nor there. It wants to build power stations which will still be in operation by 2040 or even 2050. And we are completely failing to give it guidance and the right signals. We're actually stifling investment. The Commission's low-carbon roadmap proposes a target of reducing domestic emissions by 80% and a series of milestones, 40% by 2030, 60% by 2050. Provides, of course, if we have agreement for that, the basis for the Commission to come forward with a whole lot of policy initiatives as to how to achieve that. Now, power generation has got to be the single biggest issue. So it's a help that Euroelectric, on behalf of the generators, has produced a low-carbon roadmap of its own, which goes significantly towards the goal. And it's clear from their work that the targets are achievable, so long as we don't take weapons out of their armoury. Weapons like nuclear power, weapons like carbon capture and storage. Not in every country, but there's a place for them. It's up to member states to decide when and how. We shouldn't be putting obstacles in their way. Euroelectric also says, and sometimes I don't think that politicians are getting this message, that the emissions trading scheme must be modified and the cap needs to be tightened in order to achieve emission reductions of more than the 1.74% currently envisaged within the emissions trading scheme. We don't need to do that now, but we have to tell industry when we are going to do it. We have to give them certainty, to give them a clear signal about carbon prices to shape the investments. Now, I did hear a rumour that the low energy roadmap was not going to have some of the milestones well, it's not decided yet. Well, but you tempted me. You see, you encouraged me with this idea that you take for granted what is in the low carbon roadmap. But now you're saying it's not quite decided whether you've taken it for granted or not. So I can just express the concern as a politician. If the target is simply what we're going to do in 2050, then most of us don't think it relevant. I mean, we're not around to take responsibility. It's simply too far off. There have got to be milestones to drive forward the process and the policy initiatives. Finally, just to remind you, that this Parliament has a crucial decision to make over the next few months, one that really reflects the first two questions that I put to you. Those of us who accept that global warming is taking place should be mindful that last year, across the world, global emissions increased by nearly 6%, and by 3% even here in the European Union. Now, the IPCC has warned that we need to halt the rise in emissions by 2015 if we're to stop dangerous temperature increases of more than 2 degrees centigrade this century. And on current trends, we haven't got a hope in hell of doing that. Temperatures, if the science is to be believed, are more likely to rise by 4 degrees or more, much more as we go into the next century if we don't take these actions. We need to take them. The low-carbon roadmap is currently blocked in Council. So however this Parliament votes, that obstacle will remain. But if Parliament were to vote against the roadmap, the low-carbon roadmap, I think it would just knock the stuffing out of the Commission. It would knock the heart out of all of us who are interested in dealing with this issue. It would really undermine Europe's climate change strategy. Be quite a damning blow. And I hope it will not happen.
Thank you, Chris. I'd like to go over to Kevin Welsh from GDF Suez to give us, from the industry perspective, what he thinks should be in the roadmap and what's achievable.
Thank you. Good evening. First, I would like to make a point on 2020. As my neighbor indicated, we are in long-term investments. 20 years is a strict minimum, and when you get to nuclear, it's 100 years because you've got to take decommissioning into consideration. So we're in the rather long term. And when we look at the objectives that were set for 2020, our optimism is a bit mitigated. CO2 will be reached, but for the wrong reasons. It's because we have an economic downturn. The ETS scheme has not produced the impacts we expected it to have. Carbon price is very low for the moment. You can bank it up to the into the period. So we haven't got a clue on how CO2 is going to move forward, and we would like to have a better view on that. We see on the development of renewables, again with the economic downturn, we're not sure that all countries are going to meet their national action plans in relation to RES development, which is, I think, a concern for us all. And thirdly, on energy efficiency, we see that we are lacking way behind, and again, and there I'm saying it as personally, not as GDF Suez, but I think the group also thinks it's the best megawatt hour is the one that is not consumed. And we see that on energy efficiency, there's a lot to be done. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit, and it's just not being delivered. So that's on 2020. There's already on 2020 quite a lot to be done. And so when we start talking about 2020 or 2050, we've got to take these elements into account now. On our view on how 2050 should look like, I've heard some very encouraging elements, but we agree also that there shouldn't be a single pathway. We've seen how uncertainties modify considerably pathways that have been set out in the past. Think about nuclear, think about technological developments that we can see. So we would like that if a roadmap is issued, and we hope there is, it's not a single one, but it's a dynamic one, which on the one hand doesn't pin down the technologies to be used and whatever, but rather leave it up to the people to decide and to invest based on the technologies which are best applicable on a given market environment where we have a clear carbon indication, what carbon is going to cost, and how to take that into account in our investment decisions. What we also would like to see, and that we haven't seen up to now, is a clear regulatory framework and a transparency in decisions. I think Europe has to be aware that Europe is not an island. Companies like ours and our competitors look at other markets too. And we see for the moment that when you take the economic growth prospects, when you take into account the regulatory uncertainty, the way that utilities have been treated in Europe, because we are considered as being the easiest possible way to curb financial deficits by governments and all that. Well, one notices that investments outside Europe seems to be rather appealing. And as a group, we are pushing more investments outside Europe than inside Europe. So what we would like to see is a clear regulatory environment, transparency in decisions, and also that people know what all this is going to imply in impact on revenues for people and all that. It's not going to be a free lunch. Today, I think voters don't consider it as being a very expensive experience. It might not be, but it might be. And I think there again, one should clearly indicate that. On as indicated, we would like to have a rather market-driven investment environment in which to develop these things. So again, I don't think we need or that technologies have to be pushed through as being these are the ones we've got to use. I think we've got to have a mechanism where investments are made based on market environments which are set by the authorities, CO2 prices, environmental impacts, and all these elements. But after that, I think we should let people leave their own thinking and do the investments where they think it fits better. I think we might have a less expensive rollout of renewables if, for instance, part of the German photovoltaics were built in Spain or Italy, or if that amount had been used to build them there, I think we would have had twice the energy produced by photovoltaics in the southern part of Europe than what we have in Germany. And I'm not blaming the German dentist or anything, but I clearly see that we're building technologies where the raw material, sun, wind, is not always the best or the prime location where they should be located. And there again, I think when one has a market-driven investment environment, these errors won't happen. As indicated, I think energy efficiency is certainly something we and all of us have to work on. Energy efficiency is clearly one element which today is not being promoted sufficiently, and the whole elements in relation to demand side management and these elements should certainly be integrated in that. I think research and development is also a way to see how we can move forward. I think we have splendid research and innovation centers in Europe, and rather than subsidizing technologies which are not totally mature, it might maybe better to shift a bit more money into research and innovation. And again, all this, as indicated earlier, shouldn't be looked at as Europe as a whole. You indicated too, China. When you see what's happening in China, I think we should blush because we're talking a lot, but we don't move as fast as they do. And there again, I think we should have a more open view on how to do these things and how to move forward, and get into a more international prospect. Again, as indicated, we curb our CO2, but we shouldn't be looking necessarily at CO2 emissions. I think we should be looking at CO2 consumption in Europe. And then there again, I'm not sure the picture would be as positive as it is today. We've outsourced part of our manufacturing. We're moving raw material to China, bringing it back. The transport cost is being built in factories which don't have that same environmental aspect in it. And when you look at the European consumption of CO2, I think it's gone up by nearly 20% rather than reducing our CO2 footprint. It's increased by nearly as much as the objective that was set. So there again, we've got to look at these things and integrate that.
Hi there. As I listen to this discussion of the roadmap to 2050, it's hard for me to think about how an American can really contribute positively to this discussion. So I was asked to focus on the transportation sector, which I realize is broadening it a little bit from the conversation we've been having to this point. But I think that that's probably the area where an American perspective might have the greatest ability to be instructive as you all decide where to go from here. So I am going to talk a little bit about my observations from the U.S. congressional process of trying to decarbonize its transportation sector to the maximum extent possible. Because we have had some pretty decent success in that regard, a lot better than we're doing with our electricity sector at any rate. So it strikes me that there are, when you think about ways to decarbonize your transport sector, you really have, depending on how you count them, 3 or 4 broad categories that you want to think about. The first is the upstream emissions from the exploration and production of the oil and gas, well, oil for this situation, I suppose. And this, I think, by and large, doesn't make a huge difference unless you start thinking about really heavy carbon fuels like in the oil sands of Canada. And since you all don't have a land, no oil sands oil will be coming into Europe via land, at least as far as we know at this point. I'm guessing that that's not as big an issue for you here as it is at home. Happy to talk further about it in the question period if I'm wrong. So I'm going to sort of skip over that one. And I'm also going to skip over efficiency, not because efficiency isn't really important, but because the obvious things you do to improve efficiency in your transportation fleet have been done, are being done, at least as well in Europe as they are in the United States. So I'm not sure I have much to offer you on that either. The final category, or 2 categories, depending on how you think of it, are replacing the liquid fuel and then replacing fuel. And this might be an area where we have some experience that could be useful to think a little bit about. we've been working on replacing the liquid fuel with biofuel for quite some time now. We had our first mandate in 2005. We ramped it up considerably in 2007. And when we did that in 2007, we went ahead and stuck in a requirement into the legislation that indirect land use change associated with biofuels be quantitatively assessed, and the fuels would be required to meet certain thresholds of reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in order to be allowed to fill the mandate. So what we've learned, which probably isn't news to a lot of you if you follow these issues, is that your accounting is really, really important in this area.